Yes, I think 新四军老战士申秉辰99岁，八路军老战士张平100岁，华南游击队香港老战士罗定辉94岁。
Xi, KJU, Putin gathering in Beijing, the Axis of Upheaval and all of its machinations. Next on the 120th installment of the CSIS Capital Cable. All right, good evening to those of you in Korea. Good day to those of you around the world. And good morning to those of you in Washington, or points west, as they say. Welcome to the 120th installment of the CSIS Capital Cable. I'm Mark Lippert, your host and moderator. This week on the Capital Cable, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un in Beijing, gathering, summit, lots of machinations. And with us, all-star, and I mean a true all-star, maybe an all-world all-star panel to discuss, unpack, analyze all of these events and more, is the one and only Ambassador Harris, Admiral Harris, Ambassador Kritenbrink, Assistant Secretary Kritenbrink, and of course the great Sid Seiler in for Victor Cha here. And let me introduce them formally in no particular order here. I'm going to start with Admiral Harris, and of course, Ambassador Harris, Admiral Harris. I'm going to interchange the titles, but everybody knows Harry. He's been on the show. Look up his bio. It's unbelievably accomplished. We have Ambassador to South Korea, long and storied Navy career. I guess I'd say at its high point, was Indo-PACOM commander, but a multitude of other operational policy staff positions as well. And of course, he is on about 1 million boards, so we see him all over the place these days, super active, and joins us, I believe, from Colorado. Ambassador Admiral Harris, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Good to be with you, Mark.
All right, excellent. And the Corvette is gone, right? You don't have the Corvette.
Corvette is gone. 9/11 is in the garage.
The 9/11, okay, it is 9/11, so there you go. All right, excellent. Excellent. Thanks, Ambassador Harris. Welcome to the show. And joining us for the first time, Dan Kritenbrink, who of course holds a number of distinguished posts and obviously accolades and accomplishments and a long and storied career in the Foreign Service. He is now a partner at the Asia Group, but among his accomplishments are Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, EAP, Ambassador to Vietnam, Senior Director at the National Security Council, DCM to U.S. Embassy Beijing, and as well as, many, I think, local shout outs in Nebraska, where he's from. So Dan, welcome back to the show.
Mark, thank you. Honored to be here.
All right, excellent. Thank you. And any Chuck Hagel sightings or Scott Frost sightings, either, because you're in Nebraska. Derek Chalet, another famous Nebraskan.
Long list of many famous Nebraskans. I had the honor of seeing Secretary Hagel just a few weeks ago. Great American, great Nebraskan.
All right, excellent. I saw him as well, and he's still punchy as ever and very focused on the Nebraska football team coming up this year. So
hope springs eternal.
Hope springs eternal. All right, excellent. Let's of course turn to Sid Seiler in for Victor Cha, but obviously appears on this show routinely not routinely, but on a regular basis as a guest in his own right. But everybody knows Sid, nearly 40 years of the intelligence community, also several policy jobs at the State Department and NSC to boot, served USFK, served at the DNI, served at the CIA, and now is with us at CSIS. Sid, welcome back to the show.
Mark, great to see you again.
All right, excellent. Have you been through Nebraska or Colorado recently? No?
Not recently.
Not recently. Okay. Okay, we're gonna have to get you there. I think it's good for Sid Seiler if you're in the heartland more often. But I digress. Yep. All right, excellent. Okay, let's get into it. Deadly serious topic, really important and I would say strategic topic. You know, we wax and wane sometimes between, I would say, tactical and operational issues and strategy. This is high strategy, and we have the appropriately accomplished panel to discuss it here. So I'm going to turn to Dan Kritenbrink first. And Dan, if you don't mind, can you walk us through what happened? There was a lot going on last week at this gathering. Lots of leaders, lots of statements, lots of, I guess, commentary around what happened in and around the events in China. So Dan, if you wouldn't mind, just walk us through what happened. And again, welcome to the CSIS Capital Cable.
Mark, thank you again. It's a tremendous honor to be here. I think, you know, I have such tremendous respect for CSIS and what Dr. Hamry and Victor and you and everyone there have built. And thanks for giving me the honor of being here with you today on my first Capital Cable. Maybe just to try to set the scene, Mark, it was a pretty extraordinary series of events. It started with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin, August 31st to September 1st. This was the 25th anniversary of the founding of the SCO. And so there was a lot of focus there during the summit. Obviously, you had President Vladimir Putin there, but I think it was Prime Minister Modi that probably got most of the headlines. Now, India, of course, is a member, but it was the optics of him, you know, embracing President Xi and President Putin. Those optics got a lot of play, a lot of attention. And then, of course, it was followed on September 3rd by this interesting Chinese military parade, allegedly to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. But when I try to take a step back and answer your questions, Mark, what does it really mean? I have to say I look at it first and foremost through the lens of what Beijing was trying to achieve, because I think that's really what this was about more than anything. I think both for the SCO and for the military parade, I think China was trying to buttress its legitimacy both domestically and internationally. I think it was trying to posture itself, you know, in part as an alternative to the Western-led order. That's certainly the rhetoric coming out of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. But more than anything, I think China was trying to present itself as allegedly the responsible actor in international affairs. You know, all of the language, both out of the SCO and through some of President Xi's other remarks, were designed to position China as the defender, you know, the true defender of international order, of the UN, of the multilateral system, of sovereign equality and the global South. And so I don't think we should forget that this was mostly and primarily a Chinese show. Now, I have to say, when I look at the parade, it's always striking to me the way friends in China use history. You know, again, this was purportedly a commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, but I think under the Chinese Communist Party, historical events are rarely about the past. They're almost always about sending signals about the present and the future. And again, I had the honor of sitting with Jim Sciutto on CNN International while we watched the parade together on live TV. And I made the point that I was really struck by President Xi's speech during the parade, right before the parade. I thought that was mostly a domestic speech. That was trying to appeal to the Chinese people. The Chinese Communist Party is what has brought about this extraordinary Chinese rise. He had this line about the Chinese people will never be bullied again. But of course, the international signals were never far away either. All of that military hardware, I think, was designed to send a signal to leaders in Taipei as well, and certainly internationally, that China has great stature and influence. If we look at the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, you know, I think much of the commentary coming out of that summit was a bit breathless for my taste. You know, China and the leaders at the SCO creating allegedly an alternative world order. I'm slightly more skeptical, Mark. Certainly some of that rhetoric is concerning, but I don't think it was a dramatic departure from much of the rhetoric we've seen come out of Beijing in the last few years. And certainly this extraordinary growth and this nexus between Moscow and Beijing was on prominent display. But I would argue that's not particularly new. I do think, to get to your lead in, some of the most striking images for me and maybe the most serious implications coming out of this were some of the world leaders who were in Beijing. I was personally somewhat surprised that Chairman Kim Jong-un was in Beijing. I think it had been decades. I'm really looking forward to hearing Sid's analysis, but it had been decades since a North Korean leader had participated in such an event. I think for Russia and probably North Korea and Iran as well, they probably do want to send signals about an alleged alternative world order, and we're going to stand up against the United States. But again, if I go back to Chinese motivations, which are foremost in my mind, I think in the last few years, friends in Beijing have been a little bit nervous about the incredibly close relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang. Long history, of course, of Moscow, Pyongyang, Beijing playing one another off the other. I think Beijing leaders had to be a bit nervous about that. We know there was displeasure the last few years. Things have been a bit strained. And I don't know whether we'll see a rejuvenation of U.S.-North Korea diplomacy under President Trump. But I think based on President Trump's own public comments, he'd like to do that. I can only assume President Xi Jinping didn't want to be left out in the cold and wants to make sure if we're going to have diplomacy between Pyongyang and Moscow and Pyongyang and Washington, D.C., Beijing needs to get in that game and improve its relations as well. So that's what was on my mind. Also quite struck, as I mentioned at the top, to see the images of Prime Minister Modi at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. Here too, I'm a little skeptical about some of the reporting that allegedly says that, we've driven New Delhi into Beijing's arms and this is a dawn of a new era between China and India. I think your audience is well aware how complicated that relationship is and how complicated the history is. I think there'll be real limits to what happens between India and China, but there's been a gradual rapprochement taking place over the last couple of years. I'm sure given the tensions between Washington and New Delhi more recently that Prime Minister Modi probably wanted to send some signals to Washington about not being pushed around and having strategic autonomy. But as you can tell from my comments, I'm a little skeptical again that we're at the dawn of a new era. If I look at some of the other leaders there, included from Southeast Asia, I look at their motivations as being quite limited. Southeast Asian friends never want to choose between Washington and Beijing, but they want to manage both relationships carefully. And I think most Southeast Asian leaders attended the parade with those thoughts in mind. So again, to reiterate, I think this was mostly a Chinese show, mostly China trying to show its purported influence and stature on the world stage, and probably more than anything, wanting to appear as a responsible actor. I think that message was undercut a bit by staging one of their largest military parades in history, but nonetheless, I think that was probably their intent. Didn't mean to go on so long, but let me stop there and really look forward to the conversation, Mark.
Oh, outstanding, Dan. Great laydown, great tour de force here. Lots of threads on which to pull, but let me just ask one quick follow-up to you on the Chinese question that you posed, or at least put emphasis on. I count 4 sub-bullets in your intervention: domestic audience, international audience, bilateral relationships, balancing, Russia, Pyongyang, and multilateral structure, right, in terms of this new world order, alternative, all of that. I guess the bottom line is, how did they do? What's your net out of all of this? How did it come off for them?
Look, I think in general, friends in Beijing are probably feeling pretty pleased with themselves these days. I don't think the Chinese need to do a lot. I think I think it's pretty clear they have a long-term plan to increase their influence and their reach, certainly within Asia and beyond. But I think in general, again, they're trying to position themselves as the responsible actors. So some of the uncertainty and the way they depict the chaos that is purportedly coming out of Washington, they think redounds to their benefit. I think they probably thought the summit was successful from that perspective. But I did want to make that final point. I think, our Chinese friends can't really help themselves, and and the signals they send. I thought their message of purportedly being, the responsible actor in international affairs, again, was undercut a bit by the symbolism of the parade. But look, overall, I think President Xi probably has to be pretty pleased with how it went. Again, having President Putin, Chairman Kim Jong-un there, I think he was probably pleased with that. He got some of the Southeast Asians to come. It is quite striking, though. Modi came only for the SCO. He did not go to the military parade, and we should keep that in mind. He was very careful there. So I have been told they'd put a bit of pressure on the Indians to try to bring that about, and they didn't succeed. So I don't know if it was a home run for the Chinese, but I think overall they're probably feeling pretty good about themselves.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dan. Excellent intervention. Can't help themselves. That sounds like me. I noted that McDonald's is opening an all-you-can-eat buffet in Branson as a test run. So I'm headed to Missouri here right after the show. All right, outstanding. Sid, over to you. Dan teed it up well. Kim Jong-un, I know there's numerous ways you could pull threads out of Dan's intervention, but could you focus on the Kim Jong-un appearance, because this was of great interest, obviously, to the international community, the press, our friends in South Korea. His motivations, what happened on the North Korean piece of events and activities in China?
Yeah, thanks for that. And, Dan laid out so many good points. And one thing that sticks with me as I listen to them is kind of the ambiguity, and I think it's deliberate because China, Russia want to move at a calibrated measure so that they're not, openly challenging the global order and establishing this new axis of upheaval, or whatever they end up calling it. That they want to do so at a pace where there's enough reason to say, well, it may not be that much, and I'm certain Admiral Harris will have something to say in this regard. But from North Korea's perspective, for Kim, this was interesting. He had met with Xi Jinping 5 times during the period of active diplomacy in 2018 that eventually fizzled out, because what Kim was essentially doing in 2018 was, after having established an ICBM capability range in the United States in 2017, trying to lock in some type of nuclear power status and see what type of diplomacy and diplomatic atmosphere was possible as a non-denuclearizing, not a nuclear weapon state, but at least a non-denuclearizing nuclear power. And on all accounts, he failed in 2018 and 2019, culminating in his great failure at Hanoi. None of the interlocutors were willing to accept North Korea as the nuclear power he was seeking to achieve. That has changed, obviously, over the past 2 years or so with the relationship with Russia. This helped advance a few objectives within that realm outside of purely the Russia DPRK piece. First of all, Kim is showing the world, standing up there, getting that place of prominence at the parade, walking into the venue, that he is a world leader. He's a nuclear power, standing side by side with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. No words had to come. Xi didn't have to pronounce he accepts a nuclear power. Wang Yi wasn't parroting Lavrov's. We understand, we respect the North Korea's position, but China's behavior in inviting Kim and allowing him this place of prominence essentially did the same. It gave him that impression, that image that he projected out. He's a nuclear power. He's got friends, and he doesn't need anybody else. He's got a seat of prominence in the CRINC, this China, Russia, Iran, North Korea grouping, and he's endorsing it because this is the most favorable diplomatic environment for him to pursue his longer-term diplomatic goal of not denuclearizing and gaining some degree of normalization. This was an alternative option that they warned about right after Hanoi fell apart. It was pronounced at the end of 2019, started 2020, put on hold a little bit by COVID, but nevertheless, Kim is in full swing, seeking to find how he can survive relationship with countries one by one in a more favorable environment, countries that accept him as a nuclear power and ignore sanctions. So in this regard, I think a lot of the skepticism that or concern that China was opposed to the DPRK-Russia relationship, I think they get nervous over it, but that's a strong image to have the 3 of them up there, showing that there's nothing that Moscow and Pyongyang have to hide from Beijing. At the same time, I would say it only advanced slightly the DPRK-PRC relationship. all of us have watched this relationship for years. It goes up and down within boundaries. It never gets really, really good. It never gets really, really bad. I think this was a signal by Xi that he wants to try to woo Kim into some more dialogue, and Kim might want to explore what more he can get from China. But I wouldn't see it as a breakthrough in the DPRK-PRC relationship, because there will always be tension and difficulties among these autocratic leaders. It does, again, mitigate the pressure for dialogue with Russia, with South Korea and the United States. I don't think, in my honest opinion, that either the president or Xi Jinping have great expectations for an imminent breakthrough in dialogue with North Korea. And even the president's, blurting out that he'd meet with Kim by the end of the year, I don't know how much money he'd be willing to place on that bet. Both of them are very pragmatic. Both of them are very patient. Both of them are open to diplomacy, but both of them are very realistic in terms of the reality that right now Kim Jong-un's not reaching out. And the bottom line, I think, to close up of these events in China, was that I've got new friends. I live in a different neighborhood now. You can keep knocking on the door, but I'm not going to open it. That's the message, that I saw coming out of the whole way it was packaged, but particularly by DPRK media from the very initial announcement of his departure a few days before he left. In the old days, North Korea never pre-announced these departures for security reasons. So that was a bit unprecedented. Kim mingling with other leaders. He didn't have to be on the stage all the time. That's a little bit of a departure. But again, it's that longer term goal of locking in the nuclear weapons status.
All right, outstanding. And Sid, lots of threads here to pull. Let me just ask one follow-up on your end, and it relates to the Korean Peninsula situation, which you alluded to in your intervention. But rewind the clock back 10 years ago, right? During the 70th anniversary parade, we had a very different makeup in terms of North Korea did not send Kim Jong-un. They sent obviously a senior delegate to that event, but Park Geun-hye from South Korea attended, right?
Yes.
And so we're in a very different situation. Can you explain the implications of this event directly to the posture on the Korean Peninsula? You alluded to that. I just want to draw you out a little bit more on this.
Well, yeah, I remember those days because it came at the end of a robust year of efforts on the Obama administration's part to engage North Korea in 2014. Multiple trips in and out of Beijing, China's lead negotiator in and out of Pyongyang. There was some semblance of cooperation. There was, at the end of the day, nobody will give China credit with giving the contribution that we all wanted and that we all hoped would change North Korea's behavior. But nevertheless, there was a more cooperative atmosphere. What happened is, after we kind of curtailed our efforts because, we kind of pushed as far as we could, South Korea engaged China actively in trying to move the ball forward and in getting China more involved in getting North Korea to denuclearize. And as you mentioned, Park Geun-hye on the 70th anniversary, Park Geun-hye fluent in Mandarin, seeking really hard to restore that PRC ROK cooperation to see whether that could be the breakthrough that brought everybody back to the denuclearization table. And it didn't work. She, not so much that it was a bad optic, and there were people that questioned the optic, but then following that event on August 15th, 2015, was, of course, the fourth nuclear test of North Korea in January 2016. And that kind of launched the missile a month mania that led up to my button's bigger than your button, culminating with then, threats of war and then a pivot to diplomacy. But from that point onward, China's cooperation on the North Korean nuclear issue has been very spotty at best.
Yeah,
right now,
Iraq
has very little leverage. And
the overall relationship with Seoul and Beijing, you could argue, has never really fully recovered. Yeah. All right. Outstanding. Yeah. Outstanding, Sid. Great stuff there. All right. Let me come to Ambassador Admiral Harris. Dan alluded to this earlier. He talked about a home run, talked baseball. So we have our cleanup hitter, Admiral Harris. First, Ambassador Harris, any comments on the aforementioned interventions, which are outstanding? And then I want you at some point to put your Indo-PACOM military hat on and talk about how you might view this from that perspective. Does it require some posture, all of that? The floor is yours.
Yeah, sure. So I'll make a general opening comment here that I commend Dan's great overview of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, and the parade, and Modi in India. I think that that was spot on. I also commend Sid's excellent analysis of the North Korean twist into this mix. I think the parade is significant because of the visual cementing of this axis of upheaval, which, by the way, I think is a real cool term. It's better than most of the other terms that have been bandied about. That this cementing was on the world stage visually between China, Russia, and North Korea. And now on the Indo-PACOM from a military perspective, not that he needs it, but this certainly gives Admiral Paparo at Indo-PACOM a focus with regard to what he needs to do going forward in his planning efforts to defend America and America's interests and our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. The parade was also significant because of the display of advanced weaponry that we saw there. Don't know if all of those weapons work, but I'm sure Sid's brothers and sisters in the IC will clearly get into it, and we'll learn more about that as time goes on. The SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that piece was significant because of Indian Prime Minister Modi's presence. But like Dan said, let's not oversee ghosts in the vestibule, right? Let's breathe through our noses and not our mouths. Let's not hyperventilate on this. It's possible, in my view, it's likely that the greatest strategist in Beijing was Prime Minister Modi. I mean, I think he conveyed the message that he wanted to convey, and he deliberately did not attend the parade, which would have created an entirely different visual dynamic. I'll also add that it's ironic that China is trying to appear as a defender of the world order. I mean, just consider that it repeatedly disregards international law and norms, including the UN Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, regarding its actions in the South China Sea, as well as its actions in the East China Sea, the Sea of Japan, the East Sea, and all of that. Washington-based publication 1945 with regard to what China is doing in the South China Sea vis-a-vis the Philippines. 1945, I think, rightly asks, are we seeing the South China Sea 2.0 in the East Sea or Yellow Sea? Consider also that China is weaponizing its weaponizing debt as a national strategy, and consider that its attempts to isolate, intimidate, and dominate Taiwan, and finally consider its unwavering support of Russia in the Ukraine conflict. So I'll stop there and stand by for more questions.
All right, outstanding. Can I come back to you on two questions? Sure. Very different directions. One, Southeast Asia, you mentioned the Philippines. When you were Indo-PACOM commander, you spent a lot of time there, kind of a crucible of U.S.-China competition. Because you covered India, I want to get your thoughts on Southeast Asia. And the second piece is on the advanced weaponry and systems. What did you see? Tease that out a little bit more, if you wouldn't mind, Admiral Harris.
Yeah, sure. So on the South China Sea in the Philippines, what's happening there in that region has been called, quote, the most dangerous conflict that no one has talked about, unquote. It's offset visually because of other activities in the region by China as well as other activities globally and by other actors. But it is incredibly dangerous, and we should not lose sight of the fact, and China especially should not lose sight of the fact that the Philippines is a treaty ally of the United States. And so that is significant, and that's why it's been called the most dangerous conflict that no one's talking about. I think China's playing a dangerous game when they try to deny Manila's own EEZ or exclusive economic zone. So that's important. With regard to
And then,
I was
not to interrupt you, but did the Chinese make progress with Southeast Asians in the two gatherings that we talked about recently, the SCO and the parade? Did they make any progress with the Southeast Asians?
It's too early to tell, right? I mean, it's only been a week or so, so time will tell, and we'll see how those nations in Southeast Asia, particularly in ASEAN, those nations that were not on the China side of the fence, if you will, if there's a movement to that direction. I think this is where the U.S. could step in with the right message. But in order to do that, we have to have the right messenger, right? And that's where diplomacy and diplomats matter. And when we don't have ambassadors in place in these countries, including countries that are our allies like Australia and South Korea, well, we don't have fully accredited, sitting confirmed ambassadors in place, it sends the wrong message, and it creates an opportunity for China to step in and say, look, we're here, and America isn't. You can't trust America, but you can trust us. So that adds to the narrative that we opened this conversation with, and that's on us to fix, right? Us, the United States, that's on us to fix. With regard to the parade, the first question, follow-on question that you asked, I wasn't there, so I don't know what the weapons that were on display. But what I read is that they're advanced ballistic missiles and hypersonic weapons, which I think will be of great interest to the IC and of great interest to Admiral Paparo, who's going to have to fight them if that eventuality happens.
All right, outstanding. That was yeoman's work there, to use a Navy term there. Outstanding work there. Dan, over to you. Admiral Harris set us up well. U.S. response. I want to use the last 10 minutes here to kind of go, not quite a lightning round, but kind of a short burst round on U.S. response, right? Because Admiral Harris talked a little bit about lack of diplomatic muscle, I guess you would say, in Southeast Asia. We have the military elements in the parade, and then also let's not forget, obviously, the points you made in your opening intervention about attempts at increased unity, for lack of a better term, among this disparate group of actors. What should the U.S. be thinking about here as it formulates a response and B, I guess, a longer term strategy in the region, given these series of events? Dan, the floor is yours.
Mark, great questions and really rich conversation. Again, honor to be associated here with Harry and Sid. I guess if we focus on the U.S. response, I'd pick up on Harry's comment at the end, on Admiral Ambassador Harris's comment at the end. I think it's really incumbent for the United States to respond in a responsible and measured way. We don't need to appear breathless or panicked either, because I still think we have so many advantages in the region. But I think President Xi and the Chinese leadership they were trying to send the signal that there's a vacuum in international affairs. There is instability and uncertainty and chaos coming out of Washington, and we, the responsible leaders in Beijing, are going to fill that vacuum with stability and responsibility. And I think the best counter to that is, to Harry's point, let's make sure we've got our ambassadors in the field. And I would argue, most importantly, let's make sure we have a steady pace of senior U.S. officials traveling to the region as a way to symbolically and practically prove and demonstrate our commitment to the region. I know there's a lot of focus on whether President Trump will travel to the region this fall. He has so many great opportunities, right? You've got the East Asia Summit in Kuala Lumpur. You've got the APEC Summit in Korea. A lot of debate about whether he'll go to Beijing. Some hope he'll stop in Tokyo as well. I really hope all of that travel happens, actually, because I think there's an argument to be made when it comes to managing U.S.-China relations. Leader-level diplomacy has been the most important element since 1972, so that's a good thing. But to counter this narrative that Beijing is pushing, I think it's the stops in our allies and partners in the capitals in Northeast and Southeast Asia that will actually be most decisive. And so if we want to show that we're engaged, if we want to show that we're committed, and that in fact some of this rhetoric we're seeing coming out of Beijing is not true, best way you counter that is to have the president show up, and then of course do all the other things we do as well. But I do worry a little bit. We've gone through somewhat of a tumultuous period here at the start of the second Trump administration. I had the honor of being America's ambassador to Vietnam during the first Trump administration, and I know that a lot of friends in Southeast and Northeast Asia thought they were going to run the same playbook they ran from the first Trump administration, and they've discovered that in fact President Trump has changed pretty significantly, especially on trade. But now that we're on the backside of the August 1 trade deals, I think things have started to stabilize a bit more. And again, if we can work to conclude those trade deals more formally and then get back to some more traditional diplomacy, including leader-level visits to the region, that's what I'd like to see, because we need to knock down this narrative that the United States is all about isolationism and disruption.
Yeah, excellent, Dan. You beat me to the question, which is, where does trade policy fit in all of this, right? Because I think one can argue it was, I think people saw, to your point, people saw some change coming, but probably closer to a version of 1.0 Trump administration than newer paradigm. So
look, I think a lot of friends. Yeah, I think a lot of friends in Asia felt like they had a pretty positive experience with the president in the first administration. And I think that's why, quite frankly, there was a lot of surprise and shock and some, bewilderment and anger on the April 2nd Liberation Day tariff announcements. But look, on the backside of August 1, I'm actually sensing more relief across the region than anything else. If you'd asked me a year ago if friends in the region would be relieved or pleased with tariff rates at a 15 to 20% level, you would have called me crazy. But compared to where we were on April 2, and maybe most importantly, all the friends in the region that I've talked to said it was the relative tariff rates that were most important in our eyes. We just didn't want to be disadvantaged compared to our neighbors. Given that pretty much everyone in Asia, currently outside of India, has landed in the 15 to 20% range, I think folks see that as mostly manageable. Now, most of those trade deals, of course, are frameworks. And as we've seen, even with the deals with Seoul and Tokyo and with Southeast Asian friends, lots of details to be hammered out. Still a lot of disagreements, actually, including on those investment numbers. But I still think the picture is more positive on the backside of April 1, certainly than it was right after April 2.
Yeah, and just to put a bow on it, and go to Sid, is what I'm hearing from you is guarded optimism, one, two, advice to wrap up to the extent practicable these trade deals, get some stability, and then inject good old-fashioned frontline diplomacy, including but not limited to leader-to-leader level talks to basically get the U.S., I would say, more engaged in the region and counter this, I think, problematic narrative of isolationism and U.S. withdrawal, right? Is that a fair?
You've said it better than I did, and I appreciate it. It's a great summary. I had one more thing. Again, kind of similar to what I said at the outset. I'm just a little skeptical. I know, again, it's been a bit of a tumultuous and uncertain period, but that, and that can cause some concern and questioning about America's commitment, engagement, and the like. But it doesn't automatically equal leaders, completely jumping on the Chinese bandwagon. I don't know any country in the region, apart from a couple of exceptions. I think the majority of our partners in the region, obviously, they're not looking to choose, so to speak, especially friends in Southeast Asia. They don't want to go completely one way or the other. They may have to recalculate how they balance against China and how they they calibrate their approach to Washington and Beijing. But I don't see too many folks saying, oh, well, the conclusion of the last few months is that I'm going to be driven into China's camp. I just don't see anyone thinking that way. And then, you know, for our closest, you know, allies who, you know, a total partnership with Beijing is just not in the cards. Again, they may have to think about diversifying some of their partnerships and the like, but I don't think, again, I don't think they're automatically driven into Beijing's arms at all.
All right, outstanding. Thanks, Dan. Sid, over to you. Sid, your observations in terms of what the U.S. might do in the wake of this, I guess, week of interesting machinations in and around China. Sid, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, both with Admiral Harris's and then Dan's later comments about essentially, using my words, letting Beijing be Beijing, and let our allies and partners and those who otherwise might be, you know, kind of sitting on the fence or hedging against, you know, uncertain hegemonic bloc movements, is to show why we are the desirable, attractive diplomatic partner, country for investment, country for trade. The shocks of the president's trade policy, as Dan mentioned, you know, having lived through special measures agreement negotiations in the 2016, 2017, 18 time period, being in U.S. Forces Korea at the time, I know the angst that we went through. And, you know, at the end of the day, we settled on a relatively reasonable number. And the polling numbers showed that there had been really no negative impact on the U.S. ROK relationship, in particular, ROK public support for U.S. forces in Korea. So we got in and out of that. And that was, you know, in terms of intensity, in terms of shock value, very similar to the tariffs, although the tariffs are on multinational scale. I think going forward, we need to figure out how to contain without a containment strategy, or how to contain without it actively looking like the purpose of all of our diplomacy and all of our security cooperation is to encircle China, right? We need to have capabilities. We need to be, you know, there's a lot in what Dan said, you know, that's reassuring to me and it tracks with, you know, my own, let's not panic. Let's, you know, let's breathe through the nose, as Admiral Harris mentioned, and take the threat for the reality as it is. But if you're commander in INDOPACOM and you're looking at these capabilities and you're looking at the rhetoric and you're looking at the talk about 2027 and all the concerns about the various scenarios in the region, we can continue to posture and plan for those. You know, our cooperation, security cooperation in the region with Seoul, Tokyo, Canberra, etc., all can focus on those, while also leaving the door open, as Dan mentioned, for these countries to seek alternatives. Maybe it's not a matter of PRC or U.S., but, you know, maybe there's other ways to mitigate the pressure that China can bring to the table. But I think that let Beijing be Beijing and plan to actively and aggressively seize opportunities to split countries away from China. That may be our best hope going forward.
All right, outstanding, Sid. I'm going to leave it there with you. And final word to Admiral Harris. Admiral Harris, floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm honored to be here with you all. And let me just close by saying that there's a false narrative out there that America first means America alone. You know, I always say America first, allies always. But this false narrative has the possibility of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy if we don't put ambassadors in place and if we don't engage with other nations at the leader level. So I am not pessimistic about all this. I'm actually optimistic, but there are these pitfalls out there in the world of diplomacy. So I'll just end by how I began, and that's diplomacy and diplomats matter.
All right, outstanding. And let me just, my final interjection here, moderator's prerogative is simply that in addition to the very good points you made about needing good old-fashioned diplomacy. There's also the point that you gentlemen made, I think, and I'll try to highlight it. It's that symbolism does matter at some level, right? Showing up does matter. And in and around this, especially in and around this narrative question, right? Filling that space with appearances, engagement, our own narrative to make sure that the U.S. is getting its full due in the region. So let me just gavel down and usually I use my narrative prerogative on Korean baseball, but Doosan is not having a good season. So I went into policy there. So let me just stop there. Harry knows them as the OB Bears. They're Doosan to me, but we're on the same team. So let me stop there.
Right.
Thanks to Admiral Harris. Thanks to Ambassador Kritenbrink. Thanks to Mr. Seiler for coming on and a real tour de force across a really important set of issues set. Thanks to everybody. And we'll have to see you guys back again on the show, and we'll see the rest of our viewers back in 2 weeks. See everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks.